Okay, Dad. I want to do an extra episode this weekend to cover what's happened in Moscow, this Crocus City Hall terrorist attack. The latest I've seen is 137 people have been confirmed dead. That number is expected to continue to rise. But maybe you can start just telling me, just tell us what happened. Well,
Well, okay, yeah, I'll do the best I can. Yeah, from what I understand, there were four gunmen, and Crocus City Hall is basically a, well, an entertainment venue. It's a place where performances are held. In this case, it was a rock concert by the Russian rock band Picnic, which I know nothing about, but. And Crocus City Hall is located not actually within the city of Moscow, but just on the outskirts, northwest of Moscow, but very in the larger Moscow metropolitan area on the northwestern outskirts. Um, it's not a place that I went to when I first saw the news that there was a shooting. They said at a mall. I think it's this is a concert hall, but it's next to a mall, maybe, which is in that larger structure or complex is known as Crocus City. Um, I thought of the different malls that I went to with your sister last fall, and worried. Not very much. I know how big a place Moscow is, but I wondered if it was one of those, and it wasn't. So I was relieved to find out that it wasn't. Um, and indeed, later, of course, we heard from your sister, and she was nowhere near it. Um, but it indeed was a terrible event. These gunmen walked in and with the obvious intention of killing as many people as they possibly could kill. They chose a very soft target. Clearly, this was a place that wasn't guarded, had very minimal security, and they gunned down people. They threw grenades. They set the concert hall on fire, um, and it could have been even worse. There were some very brave individuals in the crowd. I heard there was one man who tackled one of the attackers, and I was able to actually wrestle away his automatic. We don't know what happened to him. He may have been killed later, but he did, for a while, at least neutralize one of the attackers.
so there were a total of four, because I heard there were four apprehended. So was that all four of them, or were there
Well,
more that were
okay, at the time you heard it from three to five.
right?
So, and then it was four, but who knows? There may be another, but I haven't heard about a fifth attacker that's on
Okay,
the loose. So
so
I'm assuming it is just the four,
okay, so the
right?
four carried out this heinous attack. Afterwards, they were apprehended, heading towards the Ukrainian border. They made it quite far, actually, almost 300 kilometers, about 200 miles. They just got in a
Right,
car and drove off, but they were apprehended.
right.
It seems like these individuals are from Tajikistan, is what I'm
That's
hearing.
what I've heard. Yeah, that they're all Tajiks, right? From
Okay,
from Tajikistan.
I also heard that one of them did serve in the Ukrainian military. Do you know if that's been
That
verified?
I have not heard about that actually.
Okay.
Right,
Yeah, it's there's so much going on. It's hard to
right.
verify what
Yeah, and I'm
exactly is
sure that
true.
of course, a lot more information will come out. Probably, who knows, uh, during this podcast or after it. Certainly, information will continue to flow out.
Mm,
What I heard was that, okay, this I just saw this in one place, so perhaps this is not confirmed, but um, the news is that they apprehended the four gunmen, but they also apprehended that is Russian security services apprehended seven others that played a supporting role in this. They were involved in logistics and planning and so forth.
do they know the
Uh,
nationalities of these seven?
I have heard nothing about that. I don't think that's been revealed yet. Um, but I was rather surprised that they could get these seven guys so quickly. Usually it takes a while. You interrogate the attackers, and then you know.
Mm,
But this is what I heard is that they spotted the getaway car. Very maybe right at the venue or soon thereafter. but rather than pulling it over, they followed it. First of all, to find out where they were going, but then second, also to, I guess they have the technology to intercept calls, from an identified vehicle.
Okay,
and
smart.
apparently they waited, they followed him, and then as these guys started calling, their partners in crime, the security services made a record, or automatically intercepted these calls, and got the numbers that they were calling, identified who was receiving the calls, and then that's how they were able to arrest them. Again, I've only seen this from one source, so I'm not sure, but it would explain why they caught these people so quickly.
And also to let the car drive 300 kilometers before apprehending them.
Yeah, and find out where they were going. So it was when it was clear that they were heading towards the Ukrainian border that they stopped the car and grabbed these guys.
Okay,
that's again what I heard.
Okay, well, after this attack, everybody's jumping on Twitter, suggesting who's behind it.
Right.
So we have to dive into this.
Okay.
So I've been seeing everything from, it's ISIS, it's Ukraine, or it's the CIA, or it's Mossad, or it's a Russian black flag. I've seen everything. So let's kind of pick this through.
False flag.
False flag. I've been watching pirate stuff recently.
Okay, all right.
But with let's start with the first one. So with ISIS, that's what I've been seeing as kind of the position from most of Western people seem to be focusing, like saying this is ISIS, and ISIS has claimed responsibility, right?
Yes.
So
at least through one channel. It's hard to at this point to be even sure what ISIS is, what remains of it, because of course it was thoroughly defeated. Their leader, Baghoudi, was killed a few years ago, and but there are remnants of ISIS. There are channels that are known to be associated with them, and it was through one of those channels apparently that ISIS claimed responsibility. And then these, it's a possibility. We have to say that ISIS, or maybe I think more likely an ISIS-linked group. I think at this point it's probably fair to say that ISIS is more of a kind of a brand name than a real organization. And it's just something that different groups, want to associate themselves with. They just take the brand name and say, yeah, we're ISIS here in Tajikistan or wherever.
Right.
So, it's not impossible, because these were Tajiks who appeared to have been Muslims. And from what I understand, they were recruited from some sort of, you could say, an Islamist forum of some kind online. But here's the thing. Well, first of all, ISIS was thoroughly defeated, of course. The caliphate in Iraq and Syria, it was several years ago. And in truth, ISIS really has not carried out too many, terrorist attacks overseas. And I was going over it just yesterday. I mean, the two major attacks that they carried out were fairly soon after the defeat in Syria and Iraq.
Which was when?
So that was, let's see, well, the first attack was 2000, if I can remember, 2015. Okay, so it was around that time.
Okay. So it's been several years.
Yeah. So in 2015, we have there were the Paris bombings, and the most, the bloodiest part of those attacks was at I think it was the Bataclan Theater, where, over 100 people were killed.
Right.
It wasn't quite as bad as this Crocus City, but it was close. It was horrible, and it was kind of similar. Again, it was a very soft target. They went in there and just tried to maximize casualties. At the same time, a bomb was set off at a stadium, and then some cafes were attacked. This was a large coordinated attack in different places in Paris. And then about a year later in Brussels, something similar occurred. Again, this clearly was ISIS. In fact, it was the same mastermind for both of them. This man was arrested actually shortly before the second attack, 2016 in Brussels. But the attack still went forward. And that took place in an airport terminal. And on a train, on the Brussels metro.
But one thing that seems to be a little bit different about this attack from those previous terrorist attacks that you mentioned, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that in my mind, all these other previous terrorist attacks, the terrorists are never captured. They go down with it. They know that for them, the goal is martyrdom.
Right.
The goal isn't to try to escape and get out of there. That they're enticed by the idea of paradise, and that they have been pushed to this extreme, and that they've been convinced that by carrying out this heinous act, they will achieve some type of immortality in the next life.
Right. I think that's fair. It's true. And I think in both these attacks, none of the perpetrators survived them.
Right.
They were either suicide bombers or they were gunned down, for example.
Right. They wouldn't get captured. They
fought till they stayed there and kept on shooting until somebody shot them. Or
this one they had a clear exit plan and they were trying to get. So that
is different. Right.
That's a big MO difference in my opinion.
Sure. That's quite an obvious difference.
The other thing I've heard is that these people were given money. But the sum of money seems so paltry. What I've heard is they were promised 1 million rubles, which is less than $11,000.
Right. And
they would get half up front and half after the job.
Right.
Does that seem reasonable that there would be people willing to do this for $5,300 that was deposited to their bank account? I understand some people in these countries, $5,000 is a lot.
Right.
But even then, it doesn't seem right. Like I've traveled through Kazakhstan. Not Tajikistan myself, but I believe Peggy was in Kyrgyzstan.
Right.
Okay, and Ryan was in Kyrgyzstan, I guess. As well.
And actually went through some other countries.
Right. So I have some experience with those Central Asian countries. It doesn't strike me as a place where you can just find people that are willing to kill out such an advanced terrorist attack for such a small sum. Do you believe that could be the motivation?
I don't know. I don't know these societies well enough. They certainly are they're relatively poor. Those countries are certainly quite a bit poorer than Russia, and that's why you have a lot of Central Asians working there and making money, which we would consider, to be paltry, just insignificant, but is significant back in those countries. So, yeah, I mean, even so,
we're talking about GDP per capita that's average of like $12,000 for these countries. That's still not.
It doesn't seem very much. It seems true to me that also if you're trying to, let's say, looking at it from the other side, if you were some sort of evil mastermind and you want to make sure that these people, and you have the resources, as you would think, to first of all, to set this all up and supply the arms, you would have enough money to make sure that these guys were really committed to it. And it just doesn't seem like very much. But, we may be wrong. Maybe in their eyes, this was a huge sum. And it may have been a combination of...
Sometimes you get simple people that are easily influenced as well, and you don't need that much money.
Right. That would be my guess, is that these people... Well, first of all, they had sort of jihadist tendencies or fantasies or something, and they were poor, and the combination of monetary reward and
But the thing is, with jihadists, it's usually about, like we said, martyrdom.
Right.
Here, there was a lot of self-preservation. Seems like with these guys, they got caught quickly, and they're singing pretty quickly. It sounds like
right.
They don't seem.
They obviously don't have the same kind of commitment to the cause that those previous ISIS attackers do. So they may very well not be ISIS. Perhaps again, if they're ISIS, I don't think they. To my knowledge, I maybe nobody really knows, but there's not really ISIS barely exists as an organization now, and it seems to be more of a brand name. We're talking about the most recent attacks. The most recent major attack that clearly was ISIS orchestrated and executed was that one in Brussels, and that's 2016. Mm-hmm. So that's 8 years ago. So it would be rather odd for them to suddenly come back and why attack Russia?
Right, that's my other question. Why
they do have Russia? Like the reason or the stated reason for attacking, in the attacks in France and in Belgium, were their involvement in the defeat of ISIS again in Iraq and Syria. And of course, Russia was, very much involved, largely responsible for the defeat of ISIS in Syria. So they would have a motive, but it's 8 years later. And so it seems rather odd that it would happen now. Now, apparently there's like, again, maybe ISIS-linked groups in Central Asia and even in, the Central Asian parts of Russia that the Russians have come into conflict with. So possibly there's a motive there. Of course, if you look back, Russia suffered a series of terrorist attacks in the 1990s and the early 2000s associated with the conflicts in Chechnya and then what is it, Dagestan and some of those were horrific. Even like, there was that one where maybe 350 school children largely were killed. So the
random terrorist attacks do happen.
They do happen, right? But this is again, there is not anything. There were some very bloody conflicts going on at the time. Just like when you say with the case of, the attacks in Belgium and in France, that was at the time of pretty much of the ISIS defeat. Where they, it's at those times where
desperation,
right? Just lashing out in fury and anger and desperation. It's just hard to see that happening 8 years later. Now, and like in the 1990s and the early 2000s, we did have those. Russia was battling jihadists in Central Asian Russia. So there were bloody conflicts going on. So again, you could see the motivation. There just doesn't not seem to me any clear. You could point to some things. I think like there have been, recently some incidents in again the Central Asian parts of Russia, but I find it hard to believe, that's what motivates. So it's not impossible. We don't know,
Right. We can't say with any certainty at this point in time. Right. We'll find out more. But currently, your belief is that the ISIS theory is not that strong.
Right. You can't discount it completely. First of all, I don't think it's not ISIS. These don't seem to be, as you pointed out.
But some jihadists.
But somebody who wanted maybe to associate themselves with ISIS, they thought later they could tell their friends or something. I mean, they may have been those kind of people.
Right.
They made some, 1 million rubles, and then you can brag later about being an ISIS terrorist.
Right. The other thing that seems a little bit odd to me is that if these are Tajikis, people from Tajikistan, Tajiks is I guess the pronounce.
Tajiks.
Right. These are Tajiks, and they, but they made a beeline towards the Ukrainian border. Why that also seems a bit odd to me. If why not try to disappear? First of all, the Ukrainian border is going to be heavily guarded. The military's there. Obviously, there's the war between Russia and Ukraine, so this doesn't seem like a good place to make an escape, in my opinion. It would be better to head maybe towards the Caucasus, go south, try to get to Central Asia, where your region is.
Right.
So it's why do you think they moved to? They're going to. Well, this will bring me to the next question, which is. Do you believe that it could have been a Ukrainian-backed or terrorist act?
Well, you have to say that it certainly is possible. I mean, there's the fact that that's the direction they were heading in. I mean, that fact doesn't prove that it was the Ukrainians. Maybe they were planning to transit through Ukraine. Maybe they had some Ukrainian accomplices, but it wasn't official. It's too early to say for sure. But the fact that that's the way they were headed certainly suggests that there may very well have been Ukrainian government involvement, and Ukraine is kind of in a similar position, you could say, to ISIS was. It is looking at defeat, and it's those times that. Government or military forces sometimes lash out with these violent, militarily meaningless acts, but it's a way of just kind of venting their rage and desperation, their frustration.
We haven't seen Ukraine carry out anything like this level of a terrorist, really.
Okay, there have been some bloody attacks, but they have, like I think, for example, there was some of these missile strikes that were clearly targeting civilians, like around Christmas time, there was an attack on I think it was a Christmas market
I
in
remember that.
Belgorod, and something like 50 civilians were killed. I mean,
Right. So
that's a major
we have
attack.
seen Ukraine target civilians before. And they've been doing it increasingly.
Yeah, well, they've been doing it for years and years. It's usually, a few civilians at a time. It's a shell dropping in Donetsk City and, maybe hitting a kindergarten or a hospital or a restaurant or a
Right, but
hotel or,
usually they've been attacking and killing civilians within Ukraine. And
yeah,
there have been a few attacks in Belgorod, but there have also
yeah,
been a couple assassinations that were
right.
carried out within Russia, including
One,
Moscow.
right outside of Moscow. I think that was Dugina, the daughter of the philosopher Alexander Dugin. So yeah, they they clearly have carried out these terroristic attacks, but on a much smaller scale. There's no question about it. Um, but at the same time, you have like the head of military intelligence in Ukraine is Budanov, I believe that's how you
Budanov, yes.
yeah how you pronounce his name, and I think he's been justly described as a genocidal maniac. I mean, he's pretty much said that he just wants to kill Russians, not Russian soldiers, but
Just Russians.
just Russians, and that and you find other people like that. So there is a motivation there. There is a history. This would be a huge
Escalation.
yeah, huge escalation. So it's I think it comes as a surprise to everybody. But you have to say, and again, just the fact that that's where they were going has to make you think that they I won't say likely, but quite possibly, very possibly were involved. I may have been behind. I mean, rather more than involved, but were behind it.
Right.
And they did this. They hired these folks as just a way of achieving some kind of deniability.
Right.
Pinned on ISIS.
Yeah, I talked to my sister Peggy, so listeners should know that my sister, your daughter, has been living in Moscow for how long has she been there? 5 years?
About 4 years.
4 years now.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so before the war started, and she spent a lot of time in Russia beforehand as well. She's not a Putin propagandist. She's a kindergarten teacher, English teacher there. But I called her this morning just to ask her kind of what the mood is. What do Russian people assume? Do they combine the ISIS story or the Ukraine? She's saying almost everybody is saying that it's Ukraine, which makes sense. There's been some attacks in Moscow before from Ukrainians flying drones in the financial district, blowing things up, and they seem to be on the Ukraine side, but also just de facto the West is also complicit because of the Western support of Ukraine. Now, I don't know if this is necessarily fair, and I don't know how much of a conspiracy rabbit hole we want to go down. But another thing that Peggy told me was that the U.S. Embassy in Moscow released a statement on March 7th saying there would be an imminent terrorist attack within the next 48 hours. And in that, she sent me the screenshot of the actual message. But it didn't name any venues, but it specifically said to avoid concerts in that, which is kind of suspicious.
Right.
And then also she's in a Telegram channel, and she sent me a screenshot of the message in the Telegram channel, where it shows a picture of one of the gunmen apprehended. Right. That picture was taken on March 7th. There was a photographer at the Crocus City Hall that was taking photos of everything and had a pretty good picture of this gunman. And we see this picture of this gunman now that's been apprehended. We see a picture of him on March 7th, the day that the U.S. Embassy said stay away from concert venues.
Right. Yeah. Right. I think right. Is
this how crazy is this?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, it's common knowledge that in fact on March 7th, that's what the
right. That's not hidden.
US,
you can see that.
Yeah, I mean,
you can go to the Russian the U.S. Embassy in Russia right now, I believe, and see it.
Right. And it just seemed like an extraordinary coincidence. Well, first of all, that even if it happened 2 weeks later, that's got to raise eyebrows right there. Now it's been brought up with, with the U.S. government. I don't know which particular spokesman it was, but they've already said, oh no, that incident that we were warning about has nothing to do with this. So the U.S. has denied involvement, but there's obviously,
But the gunman a picture of that gunman was
Right,
taken there that day
right.
when the U.S.
Yeah, but that's what I've heard too, and it's not just the Telegram channel. I think I saw it in from another news source. Maybe it was RT. Which coincidences do happen, but that is quite an extraordinary coincidence to the point where it just seems very unlikely that that warning that the U.S. government gave had nothing to do with this. They had wind of this.
Yeah. All right, I'll just ask you. I know this is all speculation.
Right.
Nothing is for certain. But do you think it likely or possible that this was a Ukrainian attack, and the CIA had knowledge of it or was involved to some extent? The part of me is also thinking we've pumped so much money into Ukraine that it's crazy to think that maybe through all of our craziness, we fund the whole military, the whole government, that our taxpayer dollars might have funded this attack. Is that in some way?
I'd like to say that's impossible. I still don't think it's likely, but it is possible. I mean, there's no question. Again, it's a well-known fact that the CIA is very close with Ukrainian intelligence.
Budanov was the guy that said that is on record saying he just wants to kill Russians. Right. Budanov, and he's the head of Ukrainian Secret Service, their special operations. Right. And he's the one that is the mastermind behind these assassinations.
Right.
And Moscow. Attacks with terrorist attacks that he's already carried out on a smaller scale. Budanov was he the person that Victoria Nuland wished to put into power after Zaluzhny was being pushed out?
Well,
because there's Zaluzhny, Sirsky,
right,
and then Budanov was being chosen.
I think that she was actually in favor of Zelensky. I mean, that's
you mean Sirsky? Sirsky.
Okay. No. This is going back. Okay, I'm sorry. I should go. It was not actually who the replacement for
Zaluzhny.
Yeah, Zaluzhny. But when there was a question, it looked like Zelensky might step down. There was a power battle between Zaluzhny and Zelensky.
Right.
That she was in favor of Zelensky. Now, as far as and there was at that time there was a thought that Budanov would fill the shoes of Zaluzhny.
Right. That's what I was suggesting.
And I don't know. I didn't hear that.
At least he's Budanov is high up and has to be operating with U.S. intelligence. Right.
I heard that. I mean, at that time when his name was being floated as a possible replacement for Zaluzhny, there was a kind of a puff piece, or obviously meant to show support for him, that appeared in a major British newspaper.
Right. And just so people know, Zaluzhny was the head of the Ukrainian armed forces. It was the general, but now there was a bit of tension between Zaluzhny and Zelensky. Zelensky told him to step down. Zaluzhny said no. There was a weird standoff for a week or so. Now Zaluzhny is in a cushy diplomatic job in London now, right?
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. And at the same time, it seemed clear that there was an effort to push him out and push Zaluzhny out. One of the names that was floated around as a possible replacement was Budanov.
Right.
And it seemed crazy. The guy actually has no experience, as a military commander. He's always been in the intelligence side, but special operations, dirty tricks, that kind of thing. But he was considered, and he obviously even had Western supporters.
Okay, so we don't know, but for you feel like the most likely scenario is
maybe it's. I still have.
We don't.
I'd like to
try not to be biased, obviously,
right. because again, there is no direct evidence. But the fact that this warning was given, on that day, suggests that U.S. intelligence, and I think it was British intelligence also, who are very much involved in what's going on in Ukraine, got wind of this. And if in fact it was a Ukrainian operation, it would be surprising if they didn't, because they are very close with them. And this is, again, not a conspiracy theory. I mean, it was the CIA basically, it's been reported in places like the New York Times, basically built up Ukrainian intelligence from the ground, starting in 2014, maybe even after the coup, and have been very close. There was an article, a very long article that came out a few weeks ago in the New York Times that described, different CIA listening posts.
Right.
Yeah.
We
And in that
built.
article, the important thing is that, and this is not the first time that this has happened, but in that article, they again, the CIA expressed their concern about the kind of the recklessness of Ukrainian intelligence, that they were doing things that they did not approve of. And this is not the first time we've heard this, because like after the attacks on the Kerch Bridge and some of the
Right.
assassinations, then they'll come out and like, again, it'll be leaked to the New York Times. Now, the CIA doesn't like this. They didn't do this. So you can look at this, in different ways. One is that, okay, yeah, they actually they've got kind of a mad dog in Ukraine, and they're not able to control him. And they're letting the Russians know, hey, no, we're not behind this. They're doing this. Or, maybe they are complicit, involved in it, and they're just trying to achieve some kind of deniability. And I don't claim to know what, but it seems to me that no matter what, they are in some sense complicit. If they had wind of it, now the question is, they made this public statement, but did they actually tell the Russians? The Russians say that they didn't. I think at least one U.S. spokesman said that they did. So we don't really know.
Right. Yeah. What's the foreign spokeswoman in Russia?
Maria Zakharova.
Yeah, right. She's heavily implying that the West gave no knowledge of this. So, yeah, it's it's scary, and it makes me think also if we talk about just Western involvement. There was that recording that we've talked about before of two German generals talking about using Taurus missiles to strike the Kerch Bridge, which is civilian infrastructure.
Yeah, but even more than that, I mean, they could claim, well, this is Ukrainian territory,
right?
Crimea. And of course, the Russians don't look at that way, but the West does. But they were also talking about striking a military depot, I believe, in pre-coup Russian territory, like in the Rostov-on-Don area. And so that clearly, even by Western standards, is Russian territory. And they were involved in, talking about this. So they were obviously, is something that they were planning. And they also were saying that, actually Germans would have to, because these Taurus missiles are very sophisticated, very complicated, they have to be involved in the launch, the programming and the launch of the missile.
Right.
So in other words, Russia, I mean, the German military, if this had gone forward, would have been directly involved to, directly participated in an attack on Russian territory.
Right.
Which seems just beyond insane. And when it came out, it created quite I think a lot of embarrassment for the Russian government, but I'm not the Russian government, the German government.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. We like I said, we don't know for sure who is behind this, but it does seem to make a little more sense. First of all, Russia and Ukraine are embroiled in a war right now. Ukraine is losing this war, getting increasingly desperate. We have been seeing the Western powers themselves acting increasingly desperate. Do you think they could be so callous and reckless, the Western governments, that they were aware of this and let it go out because somehow people like Anthony Blinken and the CIA just like, well, we just got to kill Russians. There's that recording with Lindsey Graham with Zelensky just saying, talking about dead Russians, and Lindsey Graham saying that's the best money we ever spent. So, I mean, is that...
Yeah, again, I don't like to think that, but you have to say, hey, that could be true. It's there are probably I think there are certainly individuals in the U.S. government that probably support these. And one possibility is Victoria Nuland, who we've talked about earlier, who resigned it.
She was on record. One of her last speeches in Kiev was saying, and Putin will be ready for some nasty surprises.
Right. So that makes you think. It makes you wonder. We don't know. But, she's known for having this visceral hatred of Russia. And, it seems like she was pushed out or she chose to resign because she felt like her policies weren't going forward, they weren't being supported. Yeah, there's quite a controversy over that. But, maybe she she did know about this and supported it. It's not impossible. It's not impossible. But, again, it's just who knows what happens in these, in the secret recesses of the CIA. But it does seem that at least they had wind of this. Maybe they said, "Hey, I don't think you should do this." But it's sort of like, Joe Biden in Israel, telling Netanyahu, "Oh, maybe you shouldn't go into Rafah. Don't do that. We're against this. Here, take some more weapons." And it's the same thing with,
right.
all along
don't do these things, but we still support.
Yeah, these assassinations and so on. They've been going on, and the CIA has admitted it. And they say that they're against it, but of course they're still there, still supporting them, and still working to send them more weapons and whatever. They could obviously they could put a stop if they really. For example, if they knew that this was going to happen, there may have been like, "Oh gosh, this is a little scary. We don't want to be associated with this." So but if they wanted to really stop it, they could. They really could say, call up Zelensky and say, "Hey, it's all over. If you go, we heard about this thing. If that happens, okay, you're not going to get another tank. You're not going to get another artillery shell. It's all over." And they can say that. It's it's not like Ukraine has the means to produce these things themselves.
Right.
And it would be the end. But they don't. So it seems like even if they were rather kind of passive, they may not have taken an active role, like given them the idea or provided active support. I tend not to think that they did that.
Right.
I don't think they were
that makes
active.
Sense.
But I think they may very well, I think it's very possible that they were passively complicit.
Turn a blind eye.
Right.
Okay, well, I'm going to take a step back, and I'm just thinking about how this will be framed in the Western mind. Obviously, we are much more plugged in what's happening in Ukraine and in Russia. We follow this very closely. We're not just buying the mainstream narratives, but if somebody is watching the news now, they are not as invested as we are in this conflict. They would look at it and say, well, Russia and Ukraine, they're at war. Russia is bombing Ukraine, attacking Ukraine. Well, what's the big deal if Ukraine bombs and attacks Russia? Obviously the civilians are bad, but Russia's done really bad things. How would you respond to that type of thinking? Because some people have kind of a shallower knowledge of it and might just think like, well, Russia's killed tons of civilians in Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to kill civilians. That's obviously terrible thinking. Eye for eye is not good, but how would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I think they're, at least at an official level, even in the mainstream media, there are denunciations.
Right, but I think some average people may be thinking that way. And
it's possible.
And I see, some Ukrainians celebrating,
Yeah, well, you're right. First of all, if you've been fed a lot of these atrocity stories about, the Russians that are pinned on Russia, in this Ukraine conflict, it might be. I think that anybody should, no matter what, should say these people did not deserve it. This was a savage act. This deserves this. But maybe some people say, yeah, but the Russians are doing terrible things anyway, so it doesn't. Right. So what can we say? I would say, well, first of all, these atrocity stories, I think, are almost entirely false. I mean, in every war, some atrocities are committed by both sides. And just like in World War II, I think, that all in all, the Allies were the good guys. I'm something of a revisionist, but I'm not a total revisionist. But the truth is that atrocities were committed by American soldiers, and even on the people who are fighting the good fight sometimes commit atrocities. That's the nature of war. Mm-hmm. But I think that the truth is that this has been about as clean a war as any major power has fought in the last 100 years. If you look at past wars, like the proportion of civilian casualties tend to be a lot higher in World War II. Or it's actually the number of casualties is really unusually low, and it's clear that
civilian casualties.
Yes, I'm sorry, I should make that clear. Yeah, usually it's the proportion is much higher. Um,
Are these civilian casualties? Would you say a greater number of them are being committed by the Russians or the Ukrainians?
um, yeah, I don't know. Well, one thing is the Russians have a lot more firepower, so it's possible that more of them are caused by the Russians. I think I've looked at a lot of these different incidents that if you're talking about intentional, civilian casualties, that it's entirely or nearly entirely on the side of the Ukrainians.
Mm-hmm.
That, in spite of what you hear from the West, the Russians don't just send random missiles, to strike apartment buildings and
Playgrounds.
yes, or whatever. One thing is, um,
I think Russia knows that they need to keep it as clean as
yeah,
possible
right,
because if they don't, the West is going to hop on it as much as they can, and also they might just have some basic decency as well.
yeah,
Then they don't have a need. They don't need to
yeah,
attack civilian
right,
populations.
right. Well, one thing is that, yeah, it makes sense. They want to win the war, and like hitting a kindergarten or a hospital or whatever doesn't help them at all.
And it hurts them.
Yeah, it hurts them, and so um, yeah, so they aim for military infrastructure. That's what it's been, and that's just what makes sense. Um, but it's possible. So if we're talking about intentional, I think there's no question that it's the Ukrainians because there's been this intentional shelling of Donetsk city for 10 years that, thank God, seems to finally be coming to an end. As a result of the fall of Avdiivka and the villages to the west.
And
there.
the shelling of Donetsk city is purely attacking civilians, destroying civilian
right.
infrastructure, and that's all done by
that's
the
well
Ukrainians.
Documented too.
Right.
I mean, even
every week there's
right, and that's been going on for a long time, before the current phase of the war that began in 2022. But let's say, just for argument's sake, let's say that like every atrocity story that has been put forward by the Ukrainians, that has been reported as truth in Western media, every one of those was true. Still, if you look at the statistics, even if those were true, it would just be that the number of civilian casualties, caused by the Russians is much, much lower than in most
right.
wars.
I believe,
and it's like if you compare it to Gaza, it just becomes almost astronomical.
Right.
Difference.
So what was it? There were more civilian casualties in 2 weeks of the Gaza war, 2 or 3
right.
weeks of Gaza war
right.
than 2 years of the war.
Yeah, Ukraine. And we're talking about the total from both sides, Ukraine and Russia.
Right.
And so that just gives you an idea. So anyway, they've blown past that, a long time ago in Gaza. The number of civilian deaths and just keep on rising, and it's just long time ago, surpassed what was happening in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine is by and large, with the exception of these terrorist incidents and kind of random shellings, is by and large is a war between armies.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a war of one country against a civilian population.
Right. Okay, let's take it back, and just for the last question, what do you think Russia's response is? If let's go with, we don't know what happened. It could have been ISIS. It could have been a random act of terror. There could be other motivations, but let's just assume that if it was a Ukrainian back terrorist project here, and Russia and Putin find the evidence of it, what will you think the response be? And if we find out, let's go one step further and say that somehow that the West, the United States, CIA was passively complicit, is I think what you used, which that maybe they knew something and withheld the information, didn't sanction this, they condemned the attack, but they let it happen. If that's possible. So maybe you can play out that scenario. What if it's just Ukrainians? What if the United States is somehow, or NATO is somehow involved? What does that mean?
Well, yeah, I say, first of all, that I'm thankful that we have Putin as the president of Russia. And he's just he's a very rational, calm person, to the point of being cold, but in a good way. I mean, he is obviously somebody that doesn't let emotions get the better of him and affect his judgment. You can think about it, well, in contrast to George W. Bush and after 9/11, yeah, what we did, we ended up just lashing out, and we invaded a country, Iraq, that had nothing to do with it. We invaded or overthrew a government that was not responsible. That's the Taliban in Afghanistan. Rather than going after the actual perpetrators, focusing on them, we just went on this rampage in Afghanistan and in Iraq, with horrible consequences for everybody involved. I don't think Putin's going to do anything like that. That it's not going to be, there's not going to be a massive escalation. I hope, it'll be targeted, but it may be that, for example, they're really going to go after Budanov and they're just going to start hunting him whenever they get news that he might be in a place that, that place is going to be struck by a missile, or, and maybe, other, what do they call it, kind of leadership targets, military intelligence and
what about
military.
Zelensky himself?
Zelensky, probably not. Unless it's clear that he ordered it. And we don't know that at this point.
Right.
He may not have known.
Very unlikely. Yeah.
Right. That's what I expect to happen. Now, if there's CIA complicity, well, there's a chance that, again, it's not like they're going to go after strike American territory or anything. But the Russians have shown a willingness to go after foreigners, who are supporting the Ukrainian military on Ukrainian soil. There were recently, a few weeks ago, there was that strike on some sort of gathering where apparently 60 French, military personnel were killed.
Right.
And that may in part explain Macron's,
escalation.
Yeah, his escalatory rhetoric. So, if that happens, they may say, gloves are off, if you're CIA or, if you're any way associated with the American military or intelligence and you're on Ukrainian soil, we're going to go after you. I think probably they were cautious not to do that earlier. But that caution may come to an end.
Yeah. Well, you kind of wonder what is the purpose of an attack like this, because it's true from what I understand, it's just strengthened the resolve of Russia against Ukraine and the West. We don't know for sure if it is Ukraine, but the feeling in Russia is that this is a Ukrainian thing, and then the West is supporting Ukraine, and now they are even more unified behind this to defeat the West. We talked about being existential. This is just more and more proof to them that this is something they have to win.
Well, I think in general, just terrorist attacks don't work. They often, have the opposite effect of what is intended. It's often just a matter, again, of just lashing out, of giving vent to some kind of frustration and hatred. And it may make certain people feel better, but it's not going to do anything to bring Ukraine closer to victory, if indeed Ukraine was behind it.
Well, okay, then one last question. Could there be any other possible actor behind it that is on the radar? Something that I see on Twitter, you can't take anything, is people say Mossad. I don't understand that.
I don't see why.
It doesn't.
Well, there's some people who think Mossad is behind everything. And they wouldn't have, I think the Israeli government's annoyed at the Russian government, but they're annoyed at the vast majority of governments in the world right now, maybe all of them. So, so that there's just no reason. I don't see why.
Yeah, okay. I couldn't draw the conclusion, but Twitter's going CIA and Mossad.
Yeah, well, there's some people that are. Yeah, there's some people who always say
so I felt like I had to address that one. I didn't. Yeah, I agree. It doesn't seem plausible to me. But we'll see. I imagine they'll find out if they have apprehended 4 gunmen, and you said the 7 Pew support crew. There's been nothing official coming out of Russia right now, but
it seems like there's a very good chance that we'll find out who's, if they have that many people, Well, you have a prisoner's dilemma. He just said, when you have at least two
Right.
different prisoners, one of them's going to squeal because he's thinking the other guy might squeal. I better squeal first and get the best deal, or whatever. But
Right.
when you have 11, that just gets multiplied.
Yeah, I got a lot of squealers
Right,
now.
right. And, maybe these four gunmen had no idea who hired them, but it seems unlikely that none of the other seven, that some of them must have had contacts, you would think anyway, with whoever's behind this.
Okay, interesting. Well, we'll see how it plays out. We can stop it there. All
Okay.
right. Thanks a lot, Dad.